Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you, John, Ben. All this doom and gloom reminds me of something that Thomas Friedman, the distinguished New York Times columnist, once said about optimism and pessimism. The pessimists are usually right, and the optimists are usually wrong, but the optimists are responsible for all the great changes that have taken place. And I think nothing better demonstrates that point than the American strategic preeminence in East Asia since the end of World War II and the onset of the Cold War, particularly since the end of the Vietnam War 40 years ago. I think there's no question that America's diplomatic, strategic, military preeminence in the region has been responsible for stability, peace, and remarkable prosperity over the last 4 decades. And the American people, I think instinctively speaking, are a very optimistic people, but they are profoundly pessimistic today, and I don't think that point gets made clear enough in the Australian public debate. The Americans are consumed by doom and gloom, and it affects both sides of politics, both the Democrats and the Republicans. I think the case for optimism at first glance is quite profound, because if you think about it, the United States is deeply engaged in the region, and to paraphrase Mark Twain, the reports of American strategic retreat from the region are greatly exaggerated. Just in the past year, we've had the Secretary of State John Kerry, the Secretary of Defence Chuck Hagel make 10 visits in the region, and of course this year the President himself will visit East Asia twice. And I think that demonstrates strong commitment on the part of the United States. Of course, the other point to bear in mind is that the United States is very much engaged diplomatically, despite the fact there have been significant defence cuts in Washington. The 50-50 balance of deployment of forces between the Atlantic and the Pacific will change to 60-40 come 2020, and I think that once again demonstrates America's serious commitment to the region. Add to this the fact that there is enhanced military alliances between Washington and many of its old Cold War allies. We all know about the enhanced military engagement between Australia and the United States, most notably in November 2011 when President Obama visited Canberra and Darwin. It's a bipartisan policy in Australia and indeed in Washington. But Australia, of course, is far from alone in beefing up its security relations with Washington, among others in the face of a rising China. It's already been mentioned, but who would have thought Vietnam, America's great Cold War foe 40, 50 years ago, is today clamouring for US security guarantees? And who would have thought that the Philippines, a former US colony, would be pleading for Washington to maintain a very strong strategic presence in its own backyard in the face of a growing China? This is the same Philippines that only 20 years ago that kicked out the US Navy from Subic Bay. And of course Japan, Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, other countries are very much enhancing their security relationship as well. The proof is also in the pudding. If you just look at the last year of American conduct in the region, there are 2 examples that leap out to me. This time precisely a year ago, in the face of North Korean intransigence. You may recall the dictator Kim Jong-il threatened not only South Korea, but the United States mainland with nuclear weapons. He himself tested missiles and allegedly a nuclear bomb. And he, of course, has been tearing up the old 60-year armistice that ended the Korean War in 1953. In the face of these provocations, President Obama, rightly in my opinion, dispatched several B-52 bombers over the Korean Peninsula as a way of showing Pyongyang that it will not intimidate America's allies in the region. And I think that showed the indispensable American leadership. Likewise, again, this point doesn't get made enough of, but in the wake of that terrible hurricane, typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines in October last year, that led to more than 4 million Filipinos dying and being hungry, it was the United States, again, that played the leadership role in the reconstruction effort. President Obama committed the US aircraft carrier in the region. The US Marines played a very indispensable role in helping protect civilians and feed people who have been displaced. And of course, they contributed a $25 million aid program. In contrast, it must be said, to the Chinese, which originally offered only $100,000 in aid, which is less than the entire donation made by the furniture store IKEA. Subsequently, China, obviously humiliated, decided to increase its aid, but only to 1.5 million, which of course is quite negligible compared to the United States donations. So there is reason for optimism. I don't buy the argument that President Obama, although he's naturally consumed by crises in Ukraine and in the Middle East, I do believe that he's still very much committed to the region. And those points, I think, demonstrate that point dramatically. However, one always needs to highlight qualifications, and I do think there are risks and uncertainties involved, risks in Asia and risks in America. In Asia, there are very real doubts about America's staying power, and those doubts surfaced last October when President Obama once again, I think this was the third time in his presidency, cancelled trips to Asia because of domestic crises in Washington. He had a good excuse, of course. There was the partial government shutdown in Washington. But nevertheless, the feeling in East Asia, even among die-hard old Cold War friends, was that if America could not keep its house in order, how on earth can it keep the peace in the region? And these views were widely held among a lot of the prominent newspaper editorials and columnists and distinguished intellectuals and thinkers from both South and Northeast Asia, and indeed even in Australia, although less so. So I think that point needs to be recognised, especially when you have to remember that a lot of the countries in Southeast Asia, most notably Vietnam, the Philippines, are still highly nervous, and Japan, of course, are nervous about China's military rise and its territorial claims in the Southeast and East China Seas. It's not surprising that some prominent American political scientists and well-known pessimists, such as John Mearsheimer, the preeminent political scientist from Chicago University, Stephen Walt from Harvard University, even to some extent Hugh White at the Australian National University. Although they express themselves in different ways, they recognise that if China rises like other great powers in world history, including the United States, it stands to reason that China's definition of its national interests will grow as its power increases, and China will, over time, seek a sphere of influence in its neighbourhood, particularly when it is so reliant on export growth and energy reserves. So that's the feeling in Asia, but it's to America that I really want to focus on for the rest of my remarks. I think Americans are suffering from foreign policy fatigue. I think they are tired of the world. David Brooks, the distinguished columnist from the New York Times, just yesterday wrote a column in which he said, quote, "We're in the middle of a remarkable shift in how Americans see the world and their own country's role in the world. For the first time in half a century, a majority of Americans say that the US should be less engaged in world affairs, according to the most recent Pew Research Center survey. For the first time in recorded history, a majority of Americans believe that their country has a declining influence on what's happening around the globe. A slight majority of Americans now say that their country is doing too much to help solve the world's problems." Now, of course, he is not the only one who's making these observations, but because he said it yesterday, I thought it was worth repeating today. The people he's referring to aren't the old George McGovernites. These were the old dovish liberal Democrats who were strongly opposed to the Vietnam War in the 1970s, who for a while made up a decent base of the Democratic Party in the 1970s. we're also referring to a lot of conservative Republicans and Tea Party Republicans. And remember, the Republican Party in the United States, under Eisenhower, Nixon, Reagan, both Bushes, was the party of national security. But increasingly, we're seeing many conservative and Tea Party Republicans who don't want to have anything to do with the world. They're not necessarily isolationists, but I would describe them more as non-interventionist. And I think that the upshot is that today Americans are less concerned about the world than at any time in their history, at least since the interwar period of the Great Isolationist period in the 1920s and the 1930s. In a polity that is acutely sensitive to public opinion, veritably driven by these relentless public opinion polls, focus group surveys, and of course this relentless 24/7 news and internet environment. This means that foreign policy is severely downgraded in the calculations of a lot of politicians, both Democrat and Republican. Of course, the most obvious exemplar is that more Republicans are now caring more about downsizing government, which I think, for what it's worth, is an appropriate policy given the staggeringly high levels of American debt and deficit. But they're focusing more on downsizing government than a strong defence. And I think one of the lessons of a lot of these brushes with debt default that we've seen on Capitol Hill during the course of the last 3 years is that Washington will make cutting defence spending a very high priority in the next decade. Compounding the problem is what I would argue is America's badly damaged credibility and prestige. This is a legacy of the Bush years, but it's also President Obama himself. It's quite evident that America's ability to lead, influence, persuade other countries around the world is significantly diminished, and it's in stark contrast to the days of American global leadership, and not only during the post-war period, but even during the 1990s under President Clinton. All said, I think that the US is not pivoting away from the pivot or the rebalance, as it's well known in East Asia. I think there is a general feeling, despite all the doubts about America's staying power, that America still has huge reason to be confident. Demography is in its favour. It's got a relatively high fertility rate and immigration level, whereas, as we all know, China will grow older before it grows richer. And of course, America has a lot of advantages when it comes to higher education and innovation, as well as energy self-sufficiency, which some say the shale gas revolution may well be a geopolitical game changer. But for now, culturally, there is a crisis of confidence in the United States, and I think it is affecting the Americans' views of the world. Although I think when it comes to East Asia, and let's face it, the centre of geopolitical and economic gravity around the world is in East Asia, I think that the United States, from what we've seen in the last few years at least, is not acting like the pitiful, helpless giant that Richard Nixon warned about 40 years ago. It's very much engaged, and I think that smart heads in Washington on both sides of politics are still committed to the idea of making the 21st century the US Pacific century, notwithstanding all the doubts and concerns that I've raised. Thank you.